What would you do if the family who betrayed you was now at your mercy? For Sam Johnson, 10 years of silence ended with a plan so devastating, it would tear apart everything they thought they had built, and leave them begging for a second chance. It was bitterly cold that November morning, and the biting wind only added to Sam's misery. To make matters worse, he was battling a nasty cold, leaving him feeling utterly drained. But staying home wasn't his style. He had always believed in giving 110%, a mantra drilled into him since childhood. The family business wasn't just a job to Sam, it was a responsibility he took to heart. He never missed work unless he physically couldn't stand, and that had only happened twice, both times landing him in the hospital. By 10 a.m., however, the weight of his illness became unbearable. His body felt weak, his vision hazy, and his head pounding like a drum. Arturo, his foreman, noticed immediately and didn't mince words. "Go home, Sam," Arturo ordered firmly. "You're no good to us like this, and the last thing we need is the whole team catching what you've got." Reluctantly, Sam obeyed. He climbed into his truck and drove home, coughing all the way. 20 minutes later, he pulled up to his house, but something was off. His brother Jimmy's truck was parked in the driveway. The sight struck Sam as odd. Jimmy had no reason to be there, especially without Sam. For one, Jimmy should have been at work. Secondly, he wasn't supposed to be anywhere near town. He was supposedly in a nearby city meeting with a potential client, which was the entire reason Sam had been covering for him. Sam's foggy brain raced, trying to think of a good explanation, but nothing plausible came to mind. He parked on the street and slowly climbed out of the truck, his legs still shaky. The tension mounted with every step as he approached the house. Inside, it was eerily quiet. Sam made his way up the stairs, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wasn't sure what he expected, but a growing sense of unease twisted in his gut. Halfway up, muffled voices broke through the silence, and then he heard it. His wife Camila's voice, clear as day, coming from the bedroom. "Oh God, yes, Jimmy," she gasped. Sam froze, the words cutting through him like a knife. His suspicions, the ones he didn't even want to name, were confirmed. His heart dropped as he stood there, stunned and shaking. A surge of rage coursed through him, sharpening his mind like a flash of lightning. Quietly, he pulled out his phone, switching the camera to video mode. He pointed it toward the open doorway, his hands trembling. "So, Jimmy made me cover for him just so he could cover my wife," Sam thought bitterly, his teeth clenched. "Let's see how he likes it when the truth comes out. When I knock him flat," Sam thought, rage coursing through him like fire. Neither of the lying lovers noticed as the furious husband stepped silently into the room, his broad shoulders and clenched fists radiating fury. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his heart pounding. 1 beat. 2. 3. Then, with a sudden and deliberate motion, Sam launched a powerful kick that sent Jimmy tumbling off the bed in a heap. Jimmy's world turned upside down in an instant. His breath came out in a shocked gasp as pain radiated from where Sam's boot had connected. Camila let out a horrified scream when she turned to see her husband's face, a mask of pure, unfiltered rage. Sam's chest heaved as he rounded the bed. For a moment, he stood over his older brother, who was now curled up on the floor, groaning in agony. The sheer satisfaction of seeing Jimmy brought low by his anger surged through Sam, but it was fleeting. As he looked down at his brother, a spark of rationality broke through his fury. Any more violence and he risked turning this betrayal into a prison sentence. Sam took a deep breath, trying to rein in the tempest within. Jimmy, on the other hand, was paralyzed with fear. He knew better than to fight back. Even under normal circumstances, he stood no chance against Sam, not anymore. If it had been years ago, maybe Jimmy could have held his own. Back then, Jimmy had been stronger, and as the older brother, he always had the upper hand. But those days were long gone. The last time Jimmy had tested Sam's strength was Thanksgiving 2 years ago. It had been one of those playful moments between siblings, sparked by their competitive nature. Jimmy, ever the big brother, loved to tease Sam about being younger and less experienced. "I'll always be able to take you down," Jimmy had bragged, his wife laughing along. That day, Sam had decided it was time to challenge his brother's boast. In front of the whole family, Sam had called him out for an arm wrestling match. Jimmy had grinned, thinking it was all in good fun. "All right, time to remind my little brother who's boss," he'd said, flexing his arms and winking at his wife. The two brothers had sat down at the table, locking hands with a competitive smirk. Jimmy's confidence faltered almost immediately. No matter how hard he pushed, Sam's arm didn't budge. Beads of sweat formed on Jimmy's forehead as his grin faded into a grimace. Meanwhile, Sam sat there effortlessly, a cocky smile plastered across his face. His biceps flexed, but he wasn't even trying. Jimmy's wife laughed nervously as she realized what was happening. That memory flashed through Jimmy's mind now, as he lay on the floor, writhing in pain. He had always been the older brother, the stronger one, but over time, the tables had turned. While Jimmy had grown soft behind a desk, Sam had spent years working alongside the construction crews, building both his body and his reputation as a force to be reckoned with. And now, the brother he once teased was standing over him, towering like an avenging angel, his wrath barely held in check. For the first time in his life, Jimmy knew there would be no jokes or playful taunts to save him. He had crossed a line, and he was about to pay the price. Jimmy could see the writing on the wall. He was about to be humiliated, completely and utterly, in front of his wife and the entire family. As he locked eyes with Sam across the table, he saw something he hadn't noticed before: all the years of pent-up frustration and quiet suffering Sam had endured under Jimmy's teasing and bullying. The realization hit him like a freight train: this was payback, and Sam was savoring every moment of it. With a smirk, Sam leaned into the match, lowering Jimmy's hand halfway toward the table before pausing and casually glancing at his watch, as if he were checking the time. The insult was crystal clear: "This isn't even a challenge." Then, to drive the point home, Sam yawned dramatically, his feigned boredom cutting deeper than any words could have. When Sam finally slammed Jimmy's hand to the table with ease, it was over. The room fell silent except for a few awkward chuckles from the onlookers. Jimmy's humiliation was complete. His face burned as he forced a grin, but inwardly, he seethed. He vowed then and there that he'd find a way to get back at Sam someday. The truth, though, was that Jimmy had it coming. For years, he had lorded his position as the older brother over Sam, using every opportunity to push him down. The arm wrestling match was just a small taste of justice served cold. Life, however, had bigger lessons in store for Jimmy. 6 months after that fateful Thanksgiving, his wife filed for divorce. She had hired a private investigator who caught him in the middle of an affair. By the following Thanksgiving, Jimmy was no longer part of the family holiday gatherings. As for Sam, life took an unexpected turn. Camila, the wife who had betrayed him with Jimmy, eventually became his partner. The two married not long after Jimmy's divorce, a twist of fate that neither Jimmy nor the family could have foreseen. Looking back, I can see how all these events were part of a larger family saga. My father, Jacob, had started our construction company when I was just 3 years old. He made it a corporation, but the shares were held exclusively by family members. My mother, Evelyn, initially joined the business as an accountant, and together, they built a stable and loving home for me and my siblings. I had one older brother, Jimmy, whose personality I've already described, and a younger sister, Stephanie, though she always preferred to be called Steph. For the most part, we were a happy family. My parents genuinely loved us, and we loved them back, but the dynamic between us siblings was complicated. Jimmy was the classic older brother, always ready to remind me of my place. He rarely missed a chance to outshine me, reveling in his position as the heir apparent to the family business. Steph, on the other hand, was the youngest and the only girl, so naturally, she was doted on by our parents. She was the golden child, spoiled in every sense of the word. While I loved her dearly, I couldn't help but feel overshadowed. And then there was me, the quintessential middle child. My parents loved me, of course, and they tried their best to treat us equally, but there were unspoken realities. Jimmy was the future leader, and Steph was the cherished youngest. I existed in the in-between, not neglected, but certainly not the favorite. It wasn't a matter of bitterness, just the way things were. I accepted my place in the family, knowing exactly who I was and what role I played. These weren't grievances, just facts. But facts, as life often proves, have a way of changing unexpectedly. I wasn't angry with my parents, not at all. That's just how things worked in our family. Everyone had their place. As the middle child, I gradually came to understand mine. My older brother, Jimmy, would one day take over the family business. It was always expected. My younger sister, Steph, the baby of the family and the only girl, would be cared for. She was doted on, and that wasn't likely to change. And me? Well, I would have to find my own path. It wasn't a matter of fairness or resentment, it was just the way it was. My parents loved us equally, but love didn't mean roles weren't predefined. I accepted this, even if it left me feeling like an afterthought at times. Fast forward to my adult life. I was married for almost a year and a half when things started unraveling. The betrayal with Camila, my wife, was the catalyst for everything. It all came to a head one evening during a tense confrontation at home. "She slept with your brother, Sam, so what?" Camila snapped at me, her voice laced with defiance. "People make mistakes. Sometimes, they change." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mind raced as I tried to process her words. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate, ongoing deceit. Change? Is that what you're calling it now? I shot back. Camila sighed heavily. "Look, I can't blame myself entirely. You were too busy covering for Jimmy to see what was happening right in front of you." Her words hit me like a blow to the chest. "To make things worse," she added, "most of the times you covered for him. He was with me." The confession burned in my ears, the weight of it making my knees feel weak. Then came the final twist of the knife. Camila told me she was pregnant. I stood there in stunned silence, the room spinning. Was it mine? Was it Jimmy's? My world crumbled as her words echoed in my mind. 2 weeks later, the fallout extended beyond my marriage. My father, Jacob, was furious. "Where the hell is Samuel?" he roared from his office. "What's wrong?" my mother, Evelyn, asked as she hurried into the room. She hadn't seen me in a while, but she assumed I was still brooding over what had happened. In truth, she felt sorry for me, but she had always deferred to Jimmy when it came to the company. He was, after all, the heir apparent. "The Geraldson project is at a standstill because Sam's missing," my father fumed. Evelyn hesitated. "I mean, he left." Jacob looked at her sharply. "What do you mean, left?" "I mean, he's gone," she clarified. "He doesn't answer texts or calls. I even went to his house yesterday." "It's empty, Jacob." A cleaning crew was there, preparing it for new tenants. "It looks like he's renting it out." Jacob's face darkened. "Are you telling me that he abandoned his family?" he practically screamed. The truth was, I had. But not in the way my father meant. I wasn't abandoning anyone, I was reclaiming myself. For years, I'd been the middle child, the dependable one, the one who held everything together while quietly bearing the weight of being overlooked. But after everything with Camila and Jimmy, I realized I needed to step away, to sever ties, even if only temporarily. I wasn't running. I was rebuilding. Starting over. It took 6 months before I could begin to feel grounded again, but in that time, I found a strength I didn't know I had. By this time, I had enlisted in the army and risen to the rank of captain. My commanding officer had been dropping hints about re-enlistment, and to be honest, I was seriously considering it. The camaraderie, the discipline, and the purpose all appealed to me. One day, we were traveling to a new location when everything changed in an instant. An improvised explosive device detonated as our convoy drove past. The Hummer I was in took the brunt of the blast. The explosion tore through the vehicle, and while I survived, I wasn't left unscathed. I was injured, but in the chaos of the moment, the adrenaline masked the severity of my wounds. I blacked out. When I opened my eyes, I was certain I had died. After all, what else could explain what I was seeing? A beautiful face hovered above me, bathed in soft light, with an expression that was both serene and concerned. "Am I dead?" I croaked. Her face shifted, breaking into a cheerful smile as she burst into laughter. "Sorry to disappoint you," she said, still chuckling, "but I'm far from an angel. Actually, I'm a lawyer." I couldn't help but grin through the pain. "Well, that's a letdown," I joked. "I was sure waking up to see an angel meant I'd crossed over." "All this means is that you're in a very different place," she replied, her tone light. "But it looks like you're going to be fine." I was alive, but that moment marked a turning point in my life. After my recovery, I began to rethink my priorities and my future. Once I left the army, I put my focus on starting fresh. My family's business was still running strong, but I had no intention of returning to the fold. Instead, I began to quietly work on my own plans. Over the years, I had saved and invested every spare dollar I could, and by the time I had enough to launch my endeavor, I knew precisely what I wanted to do. Having grown up in the family business, I was intimately familiar with its inner workings, the strengths, the weaknesses, and where the cracks could be exploited. I wasn't looking to destroy them outright, though the thought crossed my mind, but I was determined to build something bigger and better. My aim was simple: to lure away their best employees and their most lucrative clients. I might not be able to put them out of business entirely, but I could certainly take a sizable bite out of their profits. It was during this time that I met Rebecca, someone who shared my drive and cunning. After I explained my plans to her, she listened intently, her expression thoughtful. Finally, a slight smile crossed her lips. "How would you like to actually burn them?" she asked, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. Her words hinted at a strategy far bolder than anything I had imagined. Meanwhile, on the other side of the family, things were far from harmonious. My younger sister, Stephanie, had risen to the position of CFO within the company. Despite her title, she was more feared than respected, her leadership style abrasive at best. In truth, she didn't care much about being liked. "Hell them all," she often thought, dismissing the opinions of the employees who worked under her. As the CFO and the daughter of the chairman of the board, she wielded power carelessly, knowing she could rely on her older brother, Jimmy, the CEO, to shield her from consequences. It was a family business, after all, and to Stephanie, that meant she was untouchable. Anyone who dared to challenge her would soon find themselves sidelined or dismissed entirely. It had been her way of life for years, and she saw no reason to change. But Stephanie, like the rest of them, didn't see what was coming next. Stephanie stepped out of her car and glanced around the busy city street. Her eyes briefly caught the well-built figure of a man standing across the road. Something about him tugged at her memory, though she couldn't quite place why he seemed familiar. Before she could give it much thought, a bus rumbled by, and the figure disappeared from view. With a shrug, she turned her attention back to the building and headed inside, dismissing the fleeting thought. The board meeting was dragging on, and Stephanie found herself fighting to stay focused. It had only been a month since their last meeting, and they weren't due to convene again for another 2 months. Yet here they were, slogging through the minutes of the previous session and rehashing old business. She tapped her pen against her notebook, suppressing a sigh of boredom. Just as Jimmy, ever the self-assured leader, stood to speak about his latest strategy for maintaining their dominance in the market, the door to the boardroom swung open. All eyes turned toward the sudden interruption, and Stephanie's jaw tightened in irritation, until she saw who it was. There, in the doorway, stood the tall, commanding figure of the man she had spotted across the street. Only now, as he stepped into the room, did the pieces fall into place. Samuel Johnson. Her estranged brother. The room seemed to hold its breath as Samuel strode forward with an air of quiet confidence. It had been 10 years since anyone in the family had seen or heard from him. The shock was palpable as whispers broke out among the board members. Jimmy cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the meeting. "Well, Samuel," he began, his voice tight. "What brings you here?" Samuel didn't bother with pleasantries. Instead, he dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the room. "I'm here as a shareholder," he said evenly. "With 12% of the company's vote." The room erupted. Stephanie's mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. She had always assumed Samuel had washed his hands of the family business after walking away all those years ago. How had he managed to acquire shares, and enough to wield significant influence? From that moment, the meeting spiraled out of control. Samuel wasn't just back, he was here to take over. With calculated precision, he laid out his intentions and maneuvered the conversation to reveal his position. By the end of the meeting, Samuel was appointed chairman of the board, a move that left Jimmy reeling. But Samuel wasn't done. At the conclusion of the meeting, Samuel addressed the group with a new piece of information. "I assume you've all reviewed the buyout offer from SRJ Enterprises," he said, his voice steady but firm. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to respond. "For those who haven't," Samuel continued, "here's the summary. SRJ will purchase all available shares, provided they acquire at least 51% of the company. Once finalized, Johnson Construction Incorporated will be dissolved, and all assets will be absorbed by SRJ Enterprises." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. Stephanie's heart sank. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What about our employees?" she finally managed to ask, her voice sharper than she intended. "We have good people here. I don't want them to suddenly find themselves out of work." Samuel's expression softened, but only slightly. "There will be efforts to retain key personnel," he replied. "But the specifics will depend on SRJ's integration strategy." Stephanie leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. Her perfectly tailored charcoal suit, pink blouse, and designer Prada heels suddenly felt like a thin shield against the unraveling world around her. Samuel had returned, not just to reclaim his place in the family business but to dismantle everything they had built in his absence. And judging by the look in his eyes, there was no stopping him. I was struggling to process what was happening. How had it come to this? Our company, our legacy, was slipping through our fingers, and somehow, all these attractive women seemed to be part of the plan to take it away from us. And Sam, what did Sam have to do with this? We hadn't heard a single word from him in a decade, yet here he was, reappearing today of all days to spearhead this hostile takeover. It was abundantly clear now that Sam had been planning this for a long time. The calculated precision of his return was no coincidence. And with him came the team that would strip us of everything. The blonde, her presence cold and commanding, stepped forward to announce that all of us would lose access to the company servers within minutes. "Your logins will be deactivated shortly," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Additionally, all company laptops have already been confiscated." I felt a spark of irritation at her calm efficiency, but there wasn't much we could do. The confiscation of our devices had already rendered us powerless. And then she added another bombshell. "Your home computers will also be collected tomorrow. Should any evidence surface suggesting tampering, deletions, or corruption of files, you will face serious charges of corporate espionage." Her words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The room was silent except for the sound of Jimmy shifting uncomfortably in his chair. My gaze flickered to Sam, who stood tall and impassive, his presence dominating the room. He looked different, tougher, stronger, and more assured than I ever remembered. His broad shoulders and calm demeanor radiated confidence, the kind of confidence that came from knowing he had already won. Jimmy, never one to stay silent, began to stammer out some protest. But before he could get far, the blonde cut him off with a sharp look. "I would strongly advise against any rash actions," she said icily. "It didn't end well for you the last time you tried to challenge him. And from what I can see, he's a lot stronger now than he was back then." Jimmy's face flushed, and his mouth snapped shut. For once, he seemed to understand that any resistance would be futile. Later, as the family gathered to discuss the fallout, tensions were high. Jimmy paced, spouting half-formed ideas on how we could retaliate. Stephanie, sitting quietly in the corner, added cutting remarks to every suggestion. It was clear that none of us had a real plan. Finally, my mother, Evelyn, spoke. Her voice was calm but edged with a steely resolve that made everyone pause. "I understand what you're thinking," she said, addressing Stephanie directly. "But we cannot afford to be weak. We are fighting for the well-being of this family. Now is the time to act, not to admit defeat." Her words were sharp, almost dismissive. Stephanie's suggestion, whatever it had been, was brushed aside without a second thought. My mother's determination to fight back only added to the escalating tension in the room. But no clear path forward emerged. We returned to debating ways to counter Sam's unexpected move, though none seemed likely to succeed. Stephanie remained silent, her usual sharp tongue tempered by the weight of the situation. When I finally confronted Sam later that day, his composure was unnerving. "Why now?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Why come back after all this time, just to destroy everything?" Sam didn't flinch. "Destroy?" he repeated, a hint of amusement in his tone. "You think this is destruction?" "No, this is reclamation. I've heard all the stories about what you and the rest of the family have said and done in my absence. So let me be very clear, this is not revenge. This is justice." His words left me speechless. For all my anger, I couldn't deny the truth in his eyes. He had calculated every move, and now, he was reaping the rewards. There was no reasoning with him, no bargaining. Sam had returned, and there was no stopping him. "I don't like either of you very much," the woman said, her tone cutting. "Not after the way you treated him." Stephanie bristled but forced herself to stay calm. She needed information, and an opportunity to turn the tide in her favor. "So, I take it you and Sam are close?" she asked, her voice measured. If she could figure out this woman's relationship with her brother and find a way to win her over, perhaps she could repair the bridge that had been burned. "I'd like to understand the new players in this game," Stephanie added. "Maybe if I show how much I regret my past actions, I can convince Sam to hear me out." The woman gave Stephanie a long, calculating look. She was the type who had clearly encountered her fair share of liars, former lovers, disgruntled employees, and could easily distinguish between insincere pleas and genuine remorse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "Fine. I can see you're sincere." Stephanie exhaled, relieved. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," the woman replied. "Sam's out of town for a few days. He won't be back until Monday. I'll pass along your message and see if he's willing to make time for you." "Thank you," Stephanie said again, more earnestly this time. "Don't worry about it," the woman said, her tone softening slightly. "Tell you what, how about we meet tonight for drinks and dinner? I don't know many people here, and I imagine you'd like to learn more about what's been happening with Sam these last 10 years. Stephanie's eyes lit up at the invitation. "Yes, I'd really appreciate that. I want to understand what's important to him, and if you're one of those people, then I need to get to know you too. My brother's been gone for so long, and if I'm going to have a chance at reconnecting with him, I have to understand his world now." The woman studied her for a moment longer before giving a small smile. All right, dinner it is. I'll be honest, it's been an interesting journey with Sam. He's not the same person who left 10 years ago, and that's mostly thanks to Becca. Becca? Stephanie asked, her curiosity piqued. The woman nodded. It was love at first sight for both of them. When Sam woke up in that hospital in Germany, she was already by his side. Becca took care of him, brought him back to health, and stood by him every step of the way. Stephanie absorbed the information, her mind racing. She sounds protective. Oh, she's more than protective, the woman said with a wry smile. Becca is a force to be reckoned with. She's a brilliant lawyer, and when she decides to go after someone, she leaves nothing but wreckage in her wake. If you have any intention of hurting Sam. I don't, Stephanie interrupted, her voice firm. I just want to make things right. The woman's gaze softened, though her caution remained. Good. Because trust me, you don't want Becca thinking otherwise. She's fiercely loyal to Sam, and she doesn't forgive easily. The conversation lingered in Stephanie's mind long after they parted ways. By the time Monday rolled around, she was determined. Whatever it took, she would prove to Sam, and to Becca, that she was sincere in her intentions. If she could show them the woman she could be, maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild what had been lost. I see, Stephanie said, her tone cautious. You want me to prove I'm serious about this. So, what's to stop you from rejecting my advances outright? Sam studied her carefully before replying, 2 things. First, you've already admitted I'm your type. And second, well, it's not every day I get a glowing recommendation from a certain persistent friend of yours. Stephanie raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Before she could ask who, Becca stepped into the conversation, curiosity flashing across her face. All right, so who is it? She asked, her tone tinged with suspicion. June, standing nearby, let the tension linger for a moment as her gaze shifted between her sister and her future brother-in-law. Her name, she finally said, is Stephanie Johnson. The room fell silent. Becca and Sam's expressions morphed from mild interest to complete shock. For several long moments, neither of them spoke, leaving June to observe their reactions with a small, knowing smile. My sister, Sam finally managed, his voice low with disbelief. Well, sort of, June replied, her tone breezy but measured. But before either of you gets too worked up, I did some digging. I know her history, and the rest of your families. Becca crossed her arms, her face skeptical. And June continued, I think there's potential. But we're not leaving anything to chance. I propose we hire her as my assistant. That way, we can keep an eye on her, gauge how sincere she is, and, worst case scenario, use the position to gather useful information if she tries anything underhanded. Sam looked at Becca, who was still processing. Why the hell not, he said finally. But obviously, we're setting some ground rules. Tracking software on all her devices, computers, tablets, phones. If she steps out of line or even thinks about stabbing us in the back, we'll know. June nodded. Fair enough. I'll arrange for a meeting with the 3 of us this afternoon. Afterward, we can decide whether to offer her the job. When Stephanie arrived at the meeting, June didn't waste time sugarcoating the situation. Here's the deal, she said plainly. We've pretty much taken everything from you. That said, it seems my future sister-in-law thinks you deserve a chance. Keep in mind that we'll be watching you very closely. Any mistake on your part will have dire consequences. Stephanie nodded, doing her best to suppress her unease. Understood. As the meeting wrapped up, Stephanie couldn't help but ask, what is SRJ Enterprises, anyway? I've never heard of it. June smirked. SRJ stands for Samuel, Rebecca, and June. We own the company. So, technically, it didn't matter what we offered to buy out our own shares. In the end, we were just paying ourselves. Stephanie's head spun. Not only had her brother and his allies completely blindsided her family, but they had also ensured that all control was concentrated firmly in their hands. It was a masterstroke of strategy, and she couldn't help but grudgingly admire it. Meanwhile, the fallout for their parents, Jacob and Evelyn, had been severe. After their failed lawsuit to reclaim the company, an ill-advised attempt handled by a desperate and underqualified law firm, their financial situation crumbled. The courtroom encounter had been particularly humiliating. Rebecca, a striking red-haired lawyer with a fearsome reputation, had dismantled their arguments within minutes. The case lasted all of 30 seconds before it was thrown out. With their funds depleted and no other options, Jacob and Evelyn were forced to move into a modest one-bedroom apartment they could afford on Social Security. Evelyn now spent her days as an unpaid nanny for Jimmy and Camila's children, while Jacob found solace in quiet tasks, far removed from the bustling world of business they had once ruled. Stephanie left the meeting determined to make the most of this opportunity. If there was even a sliver of a chance to rebuild her relationship with Sam and salvage what little remained of her family's dignity, she was going to take it, no matter how closely they watched her every move. Jacob spent his days in quiet misery, parked on the couch, lamenting how his life had turned out. The elderly couple, once the head of a thriving business empire, now lived on the brink of poverty, surviving solely on Social Security. Their anger and resentment over their downfall kept them isolated, unable to reach out to their youngest son, Sam, or their daughter, Stephanie. Even their connection with their eldest son, Jimmy, was sporadic at best. Visits were rare, and when they did happen, they were short and strained. Evelyn had taken on the role of an unpaid nanny for Jimmy and Camila's children, finding a small semblance of purpose in her grandchildren. Jacob, however, spent his time stewing in bitterness, often complaining about the injustice of it all, even as his world had shrunk to the confines of their modest apartment. Camila, on the other hand, was grappling with her own discontent. Frustrated by the growing distance in her marriage and Sam's newfound success, she harbored a mix of envy and regret. While outwardly trying to maintain composure, her thoughts often wandered to ways she could win Sam back. The idea of throwing the stubborn redhead, Rebecca, out onto the street fueled her fantasies. Camila convinced herself that, given the chance, she could seduce Sam, reigniting the spark they once shared. Her desperation bubbled over one day during a heated confrontation. She attempted to charm Sam, hinting at past moments and making bold suggestions. "Sam," she said with a forced smile, "remember when we talked about being adventurous, maybe inviting someone else into the mix? Just imagine what we could have again." The room fell silent, but not because of her words. Rebecca, June, and Stephanie, who had arrived mid-conversation, stood nearby, quietly observing the scene with thinly veiled disgust. Sam, however, remained seated, calm and unmoving, a small smile playing on his lips. He let Camila's desperate attempts play out without a word, his silence more cutting than any retort. When Camila finally realized her pleas were falling on deaf ears, she broke down into sobs. Sam leaned back in his chair and finally spoke, his voice steady and measured. "Camila," he began, "you've always been creative in your excuses, but this performance? It's embarrassing. You need to let it go." Meanwhile, Jacob and Evelyn's refusal to confront their bitterness kept them distant from any potential reconciliation. Their hatred for Sam, fueled by fanaticism, blocked any effort to mend bridges. They didn't reach out to Stephanie either, though she had tried to reconnect on more than one occasion. The only glimmers of joy they found were in watching Jimmy's children grow up, but even that was overshadowed by their unspoken resentment toward the choices that had led them to their current situation. Jimmy himself had spiraled into mediocrity, working a low-paying labor job far from the lofty position he once held. His arrogance and lack of foresight had cost him everything, leaving him to scrape by while his former life became nothing more than a bitter memory. The Johnson family's fractured relationships and unhealed wounds left them scattered, clinging to remnants of what once was. Sam's success with SRJ Enterprises stood as a stark contrast to the ruin left behind, a constant reminder of the cost of betrayal, and the strength of someone who had been underestimated for far too long.